Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is psychologist and behavioral scientist Dr. Eric Brymer, who is a professor at Southern Cross University in Australia. Dr. Brymer's research focuses on the human-nature relationship, the impact of outdoor adventure sports on well-being, and experiential outcomes of outdoor extreme sports. He is the author of the book titled Phenomenology and the Extreme Sport Experience. Dr. Brymer, it's an honor to have you on Old Bodies Outside.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you can join from Australia, but why don't we jump right into hearing about your long history of research? I know you've been conducting research on adventure sports and outdoors and well-being for over 2 decades. And with further ado, I'm just going to jump right in and we'll kind of get started with it because I'm very interested in hearing about all the benefits that come with outdoor adventure sports. So what drew you to researching outdoor adventure experiences and outdoor extreme sports?
Yeah, well, I was an adventure coach for quite some time, and I've always had this uh, sort of challenge where I'd like to use my body and I like to use my brain. And the more I was working in the adventure coach, it's obviously a very intellectual problem-solving type thing as well, because you're working with different people in different environments, and you have to take all the different sort of considerations into account to be successful and effective. But there was always something nagging and niggling at the back of my mind saying, I'd like to know more about, what's going on here. And especially when you could see change in people, you could see how people developed and you could see how, people were transformed in many ways through the activities you're doing. So I worked across sort of young people to older people in tourism context, in recreational context, but also in a sport context. I was coaching adventure sports for a competitive group as well for a while. But I could definitely see there was some links there. So then I decided to go and do a master's in sport and exercise psychology, focusing on the adventure sports, and realized at that time that the research that I was reading, the research on that area didn't reflect what I understood to be the experience, what didn't reflect my experience. Definitely didn't reflect the experience of some of the people I was working with. So that opened the door then to thinking, well, okay, what is going on here? Maybe I should go and investigate it a little bit more. So I did a part of my master's degree. I did we had to undertake a small project. So I looked at expedition leadership and teamwork and other such areas. And then from there, I was very interested in trying to understand the adventure experience and decided, well, probably a good place to start was looking at the most extreme end of the adventure, figuring out what that was all about. Then maybe we could use that knowledge to extrapolate to the perhaps less extreme cousins of the similar activity. So that's how I got into it, and that's where my journey started. But we've taken all sort of twists and turns since then.
Yeah. Well, I like that you started on this kind of end of the continuum with extreme sports. But before we jump into that, I want to know what is considered. First off, we know what nature is. People have a good understanding of the outdoors,
Yeah.
but what's adventure? What does that mean?
Yeah, adventure is a really complex notion, and actually, probably what we call adventure now, once upon a time, used to be called life, and probably is for many people around the world. We've tried to sort of differentiate it from everyday life, perhaps because our everyday life has become quite boring. We're seeking safety continually, and so we've had to, we've created a word to describe something that we do. For some people, adventure is about, it's about what goes inside, that psychological element, and maybe they talk about taking risks, or maybe they talk about the risk-taking personality. For some people, it's about participating in what has been called dynamic environments. So it's the fact that the natural world is always changing. I struggle with both of those two because I don't see it as purely an internal thing. And pretty well all adventures are dynamic in different, all the environments are dynamic in different ways. Whether it's a social environment always changing, or, even driving to school this morning, taking my my son. I mean, the change is there. It's been raining for a couple of days in Queensland. Nobody knows how to drive in rain in Queensland because it doesn't happen that often. So that environment was changing all the time, but I wouldn't necessarily call it an adventure. So to me, it's this kind of combination between environment, person, and activity, and definitely about the way we relate within the natural world. That sort of person-environment relationship is very much part of that. And I don't think it needs to be something that is overly novel. It's something we could be doing for off and on for a while. So it combines all those three different elements. It's something where we are figuring out where what we're capable of doing. We're figuring out where our comfort zone is, not necessarily going beyond our comfort zone. It's something where we are working in relation to the natural world, and we're very much attuned to information in the nature, within the environment, in the natural environment in particular. And it's something that involves a particular kind of activity. So we're traveling within that process in a way that means we have to be highly attuned to the information in the environment to be successful, in a way that whilst we have to understand our own capacities physically, psychologically, etc., but it is something that allows us to move a little bit beyond the everyday life. So that to me, it's all three of those things, and all three of those things in a relationship notion. I struggle with the risk-taking kind of focus on adventure, only because that then makes the assumption if you want to be a good adventurer, then you have to have a risk-taking personality, and adventure is all about taking risks, and it also means that adventure is only for a limited number of people. And I don't agree with that. I think adventure is for everybody. It may not be that everybody wants to, proximity fly or kayak over, the 30, 40 meter waterfalls or something, but that doesn't mean that adventure isn't for everybody. And so some of those traditional definitions, I think we have outgrown. And I also think that when you look at some of the way that adventure has been utilized in a therapeutic context or an educational context, if we keep sort of pushing the risk-taking type of definition, then we're not doing justice to those that we're working with in those contexts. We're not doing justice to the young people we're working with, and we're not doing justice to the people that we might be working with in a therapeutic context. And I really think that the kind of idea that says, it's all about learning how to take risks, if that's all we've got in adventure, then to me it's a very limited perspective of what adventure is all about and what the potential is. So I hope that answers your question in a roundabout way, because I'm not sure we're 100% there yet. We've proposed a few definitions, and I've seen there's been a couple of papers recently that I've been part of the review where people are proposing other definitions. But for me, it's got to come out of the person. It's got to be within that person-environment relationship. It's neither one nor the other, and that relationship is really key to it.
Yeah, and so that was a very interesting explanation. And one of the things that you said was that it's people getting outside of the kind of ordinary functionings during their
Mm.
life, during their day. And so, and I agree with you about like getting away from the risk taking part, because that's not for everyone, and everyone can have access to adventure. But does that mean that maybe adventure requires a little bit of discomfort to get outside of your ordinary functionings, where it's like you got to have a little bit of, I'm not talking risk at all. I'm just talking, like
Mm.
for me to get out of my daily routine can be, a little bit uncomfortable
Yeah,
just because it's unknown. Could that be
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
within that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's kind of what I meant by that sort of element where we're finding out where our comfort zone edges. I think in today's society, we use this word, pushing your comfort zone or going outside your comfort zone. I'm not sure that's really right either, because some of
Okay.
the when I did my work on extreme sports many years ago, many of the participants say, "Well, I never go outside of my comfort zone," and then you find out what they're doing. And you think, "Well, if that's not going outside your comfort zone, then what is?"
Yeah.
And what they explain is if they're going outside their comfort zone, then that's when things can go wrong,
Hmm.
because they don't have they're doing something where they're not really attuned to the information in the environment. They haven't done the background work that's required. They haven't planned. They haven't trained. They're doing something where it's outside, their level of knowledge of their own capacities, physically, psychologically, etc. They're doing something outside of that as well. So there seems to be something about the comfort in the way that we've got used to being sedentary and quite bland and quite safe. So from that perspective, yes, but not from the perspective of, so it's more like finding out where your comfort zone is. Rather than pushing beyond your comfort zone.
Okay. Finding where your comfort zone's at, and then also, that environmental aspect too, whatever the
Yeah.
environment is, but especially that nature component. When you combine the two, I got to imagine there's a
Mm.
lot. It's a powerful benefit, probably many benefits.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. There's three things going on. We've known for decades now that physical activity is really, really good for you. And a recent meta-analysis came out to show that actually physical activity, from the point of view of interventions for anxiety and depression, physical activity is more effective than traditional psychotherapy and other such things. So we do know that physical activity is really, really good for you. And adventure includes physical activity. We also have known now for decades that, feeling, relating with, feeling part of, being in nature is really, really good for you. In fact, research has shown that that doing sort of physical activity in nature has benefits way and beyond and above the benefits you get from physical activity alone. And that's partly because, whether we like it or not, we are nature. And it's one of the things that it kind of comes into that idea of finding out where your comfort zone is that we spoke about earlier on, in the sense that we've kind of forgotten that we're, over the years, in the same way we've forgotten that we have bodies and we need to move them and we need to be physically active on a regular basis. We've also forgotten that we're part of the natural world. So interacting with the natural world is fundamental to what it means to be human. But we have created environments now where interacting with the natural world is a thing that we do sometimes because we've got roof overheads, fantastic. We've got fresh water for most of us anyway around the world, fantastic, especially in the modern Western world. We've got all those lovely things that we can do. But as a result of doing that, we've sort of, we've isolated ourselves. I often describe it, it's rather like the tiger in the cage. Many, many years ago in the zoos, tigers used to be in cages. And they used to pace up and down and be very distressed, and they weren't really tigers at all. We figured that out many years ago, that actually that's probably not a good idea to put a tiger in a cage. And now we've created much more tiger-like environments, even though they are not perfect for tigers because they're still zoos, but they're much more tiger-like environments. And we do things like, put the food on big poles, or we hide it somewhere. So we give them something that enables them to be a tiger, what we call a form of life, a tiger form of life. But as a human form of life, we've kind of caged ourselves like that tiger over centuries. And we haven't quite figured out yet that the reason why we're pacing up and down and have mental health issues and physical health issues is because essentially what we've done is caged ourselves. We put ourselves into this tiger, the previous tiger-like environment. And we are yet to realize that actually we need to create environments in the same way that we have done for the tigers. We need to create more human-like environments. And in the end, humans are like every other animal. They have evolved to be in relation with the natural world. And as a result, when humans are most well, it's because they're interacting effectively with the natural world. So that's two elements of it. Then adventure itself is something, adds another little twist to it. So you've got the benefits of physical activity, then you've got the extra benefits of the natural world, and then you've got the extra benefits of it, again, of being adventurous. And interacting with the natural world can include things like, doing mindfulness under a tree, or it can include, the sort of gardening and growing your own food and all those sort of things, which at one level you could argue, has an element of difference in it. But adventure, when you look at it the way we've described it to now, adds that extra element where you're figuring out where the edge of your comfort zone is. So that means you might have heightened emotions. It means you might have to be really attuned to sort of quite nuanced elements in the natural world. So if you're whitewater kayaking, it's absolutely essential that noise that you can hear, that little wave, the way that bit of water is working, that you really understand what the implications of that are. You don't just sort of barge through it. In the same way that if you are, if you're climbing to realize what the shadow or whatever it is that's on the rock, what it indicates and how it might be useful to you is really, really important. So if we rethink the way that we relate and we move, and we see it much more as a sort of that relationship notion with the natural world, where we are attuned to little bits of information that help us achieve the goals, that help us move through the natural world in an effective way, then all those three bits together suggest that you've got something really, really powerful, far more powerful than anything else as a human being that we do. And when you then realize that all of those things are aspects of what it, fundamental aspects of what it means to be human, you can see that the impact of doing all those three can be, way and beyond, the sort of Hollywood trend of going to your therapist. Not to say that that isn't useful for some people, but actually maybe what we need to do is come back to what it means to be human. And what are human beings? Well, we are naturally meant to be adventurous. We are naturally meant to be doing the stuff that we do in relation to the natural world, and we're naturally meant to be physically active. And adventure activities do all three of those things.
Yeah. Gosh, Eric, you got me thinking about my life. And I work in a box called my office. I drive to and from work in a box called a car. And then I come home and I sleep in a box called my house. And if an insect comes to my
Yeah.
house, we make sure to take it outside because it's not allowed
Yeah.
in the box. I don't have, I'm pacing back and forth in life, and I don't have heightened senses because I don't need to. And, I think that like it compromises a piece of, for maybe being in casual terminology to like, oh gosh, like I'm not living the way I should be, and I don't really know what's missing.
Mm.
Well, it's nature probably.
Yeah, it's being in relation. It's having that fundamental experience of being attuned to information in the natural world. And the trouble is that because we aren't attuned, or many people, don't have that capacity or the opportunity to develop those skills, to learn, to revisit those kind of skills, because they are naturally there. They're not things that we have to they're not skills that we have to. There may be skills how we're aware of them and how we utilize them, but they're not things that we have to develop. There are things that we have to realize that we've already got, and therefore how well do we use them. In the same way that we have to realize that we have a body and how well do we use it. And we have a tendency at the moment to look at the gym as the answer, but maybe actually what we should be doing is looking at how we interact with the natural world and climbing trees and things like that. We only have to look at kids. If you give young people the opportunity to be out in nature, you can see exactly what human beings are supposed to be doing in the natural world. If they're out there, the tree is meant for climbing. The ditch or the stream or the river is meant for paddling in or throwing stones in. There are ways that we interact with the natural world that are innately human. And I think the other thing to think about also is that we often confuse the time and benefits of being in nature with a kind of an aesthetic quality of the natural world. And maybe there are aesthetics qualities, i.e. the color or whatever it might be. But actually, when we rethink psychology a little bit and we realize that the relationship we have with the natural world is more functional, i.e. what it offers us as things that we can do, we can pick up sticks, or we can use sticks to dig things, or trees can invite climbing, or streams can invite paddling in. So they're about opportunities for us to be active. That in itself also changes some of the ideas we have about the impact of being in nature and being outdoors, and of course the impact of adventure as well.
Yeah, no, the impact of all that sounds wonderful. And I was kind of thinking from the parental standpoint, where I've come across some parents that they've not been in tune with nature for a long time, and their children go out there, and the safety net gets thrown really wide and far, and it's almost like, oh,
Mm.
like, because I'm a parent and I don't, I've not been in nature, I've not allowed myself to go out in nature. My kids, like, that's an unknown zone. I don't want them doing that. And
Mm.
it's like, oh
Mm.
man, like I feel like that could be,
Mm.
hurt their development.
Yeah, my feeling is we can't always put the blame down on the individuals, because in the end, what we have created over the years is a cultural environment that says safety is number one. So even the way we've
Yeah.
designed our everyday social environments, it's about ensuring safety. So I sometimes use Maslow's triangle as a nice metaphor for this. We've done a fantastic job at creating, at least in the Western world, at creating places for shelter, so our houses, or relatively fresh, clean water for most of the time, or easy ways of cooking, easy ways to get our food. So we've done a really good job at ensuring, from a safety perspective, that everything's in place. We can get medical support relatively quickly, most of us in the Western world, and really good, medical support. But the problem is, all the focus has been on the safety element of things, making sure all these things are in place. And as a result, we've covered the first two, layers of Maslow's triangle reasonably well, but we've designed out of our environments all the really important bit, including self-actualization and all those other things. So what we've done is really effectively created a culture, a society that says, don't get hurt. Be careful that, if you're ill, we've got something to, and all those sort of different things. And as a result, individuals in the end are brought up with that mindset, and individuals will reflect that mindset in the way they behave because of the way our societies are designed, because of the way our culture sees some of these things and the importance that our culture puts on these things. And you can understand why, there's no, it is important that we do those sort of things for so many different reasons. But I think we've come to an age now where we need to say, yeah, fantastic. We've done this. Now we need to open up a little bit more. And, the idea of being urban adventures, such as parkour, where people are, they learn to attune to different information in the environment. You no longer have to go into a building via the front door, or you no longer have to use the steps to climb from one level. You don't have to climb, walk on the pavement. There's so many other ways you can move through the through this urban environment. And you can also imagine, families walking down the road with lots of trees there, and some kind of urban environment, and they say, "Oh yeah, of course you can, kids. You can climb that tree if you like. Go for it." You can imagine how very quickly the council would be there, or whatever it may be, to say, "No, you can't do that. You can't climb those trees," because they're afraid that somebody might sue them or something along those lines. So we have created a culture and a society, physically and socially, that says, we've got to stay within these kind of containments because that's the safe way to be. And there's really good reasons for us. But I think now we need to start opening that cage door, and we need to open the cage door to allow the human tiger to interact with their environment in a kind of human tigerish type of way, rather than leaving ourselves in that cage with the door locked. We need to open it, and we need to allow some of these other interactions to happen more effectively. And then we need to design our environments to encourage some of these things, culturally as well as physically, so that it is okay to climb the trees in the middle of the street. It is actually okay to go into a building in the second floor or whatever it might be, because you've climbed the wall into it rather than through the front door. We have different ways of thinking about how we move in those environments that allow us to be adventurous in all sorts of different ways, that allow us to be physically active, that allows us to be also more in tune with the natural world. The way we design the environment is not about the aesthetics of having lots of plants everywhere. It's how we interact with that natural world, even in urban contexts. I think we need to start thinking more carefully about that.
Yeah, I feel like going back, gosh, a couple thousand years ago, we had Plato's allegory of the cave. Are we ready for Brymer's allegory of the tiger cage?
Well, we'll see, won't we?
Wow. Okay. Well, that's no, the tiger cage though. It's really worked well for an example in this conversation, though. It really has, and I'm sure it's probably something that you bring to your classrooms when you're talking and whatnot. But one of the things you've been describing all these benefits, and is this all encapsulated in well-being?
Yeah, I mean, well-being. It's not about ignoring the fact that we have, we have the capacity to feel in different ways. Sometimes we feel not so good, and sometimes we feel fantastic, and we have a whole range of ways. And it's different for different people, and there are all sorts of different reasons why some people might not feel fantastic continually, or feel pretty horrible continually, and other people might be fortunate enough to feel really good continually for all sorts of different reasons. But we have the capacity as human beings for a range of feelings. And one of the things that the work in extreme sports is indicated, for sake of example, is that rather than labeling this sort of continuum of experiences as some are good and some are bad, is actually they're all experiences that we need to pay attention to. And extreme sports, one of the major ones, of course, is the idea of fear. So that fear is often being labeled as a bad thing. We need to avoid it. It's not good because it makes us feel a little bit emotionally uncomfortable. But actually, in extreme sports, fear is really important. If you don't feel the experience of fear, then it's likely you won't be, you won't be made aware that you need to pay real attention to what's going on around you. Something is indicating that this sense of fear, you need to pay attention to it. And then that allows you then to say, well, okay, what is it? Is that something I heard? Okay, maybe that's an avalanche I can hear in the background, or what is it going? So you suddenly have that sensation of fear, says, pay attention, what's going on? So it becomes information. So the way we feel, these emotional sort of states that we have, are actually about information. They're about saying, okay, pay attention here. What is this? What is this sort of sense wanting me to, to take heed of, to be aware of? And then what can I do in this situation now that I've figured out what it is? So what we've got then is a sense of the idea of well-being, which is where your question came from, not in the sense of it always being positive, lovely, but in the sense of the way we reinterpret these experiences, these emotions that we have. And instead of saying, right, this is bad, avoid it, actually, oh, what's going on here? This is information. This is telling me that I need to pay attention for some reason or other. What do I need to pay attention to, and what is it that I can do with it? And there are lots of ways that people describe that process, and some can be long-winded and very cognitive. Others can be much more, embodied in the sense that it's not a whole bunch of, well, X equals Y and Y equals Z, and therefore I must do this. It's much quicker and much more sort of embodied than that. But then well-being becomes a holistic understanding of how to live well, how to be well. And that isn't avoid all the nasty stuff, all the stuff that makes me uncomfortable. It's saying it's accepting it all. And then once you've accepted it all, what are these things? Why are these things in my life? Why am I feeling really good now? What is it that I need to pay attention to? What is it why am I not feeling so good? Why? And all those kind of questions that can go on. So well-being becomes the acceptance of all those sort of things, with the idea of living a really well life. And adventure and extreme adventure, if you ever want to go that level, are really good ways of understanding that, of coming to terms with those sort of things. Because some of the experiences that you have, especially in more extreme adventures, are really sort of things that people search for all their life. People say, I've been doing meditation for 15 years, but first time I did an adventure, I got the experience that I was looking for. But also the way that we understand these experiences in much more sort of in terms of them being information rather than good or bad.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like that's almost sitting on something larger where I feel like, as a society, we're very focused on safety. We talked about that earlier. And to touch on that, when we talked about that earlier, gosh, safety is such a there's so much capitalism behind safety. But then like just now talking about looking at this holistic approach of well-being, it got me thinking how also as a society, we tend to think of things dichotomously. It's either good or bad. And I think
Yeah.
that well-being, your explanation there, would really pointed towards like, no, that's not dichotomous. It's what's going on. What are my senses telling me? What am I learning from this? And that was an interesting explanation I've not heard before about well-being.
Yeah. And the other thing, from my perspective, the fundamental element of that is to think, well, what are human beings designed to do? Well, we're designed to interact with the natural world. We're designed to be attuned to information in the natural world. We're designed to move.
Yeah.
We're designed to actually figure out what we're capable of, emotionally, psychologically, physically, and therefore we're designed to be physically active, outdoors, being adventurous. That's what we're designed to do. That's what kids would do naturally.
Yeah.
But adults, for some reason or other, have told themselves they shouldn't be doing those sort of things.
Yeah. From my subjective experience, it seems like the outdoor recreation industry has been growing. Is that something? And more people are kind of like, okay, like I need to get out, not need, but I want to get outside. Maybe I need to get outside. But have you been seeing
Yeah.
that trend too? Is that something that's there?
Yeah, there's definitely research that suggests that's international as well. Even parts of the world that perhaps once upon a time wouldn't have seen these benefits being worthwhile are being much more adventurous now. Places like India and China and so forth. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
research suggests that the numbers are increasing exponentially in those in countries that we wouldn't necessarily associate with these sort of activities. So I would say internationally, and there's research done in the UK to show that the type of activity that is growing most rapidly is outdoor adventure activities. Traditional sports are being overtaken by outdoor and adventure activities. So there's all sorts of pointers to say that actually being outdoors, being adventurous, being physically active is the way to go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's just fantastic. And so, one of the things I also wanted to focus on, and we kind of talked about it in our conversation before we started recording. Um, on top of well-being, though, I also wanted to hear a little bit about how maybe being outdoor, doing outdoor adventures, can help with humility.
Yeah, I think I think that's a really interesting question for all sorts of different reasons. And I think, again, that links to the way our society and culture has developed over the years. And we've become very individualistic, driving for individual success. And this idea of success looks like whatever it looks like, fancy red sports car, big house, lots of money in the account, and all those sort of things, which actually, when it comes down to it, are the sort of pointless and relatively useless to extent once you get past a certain point. Do you really need more money? Do you really need a bigger house? Does your car really need to be going at sort of 250 kilometers rather than 100 kilometers an hour? The answer is possibly no, but maybe that's just my perspective. So what happens when people interact with the natural world in a more adventurous way is that the idea of being in competition against nature, people start to realize that actually, if nature really wanted to, you could snuff you out in a second. There is no competition. Not only is there no competition, but the natural world doesn't even recognize the fact that you're there. So there's no way that Everest says, oh, look, there's 300 people on me today. Which one of these shall I snuff out? Well, I'll go for number 1, I'll go for number 10, I'll go for number 33. Okay, flick, 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 they're all gone. It doesn't work like that. So there is no competition. There is no sort of idea of I'm going to conquer Everest, or I'm going to conquer this big wave, or I'm going to do that, because it just doesn't exist. The more adventurous you get, the more you realize that actually, if you want to do this again, that means you have to survive. And you have to not only survive, but you have to survive in a way that allows you to do it again. So surviving, but you've lost all your limbs and all those sort of things is no longer, you've got to come away from it thinking, oh, wow, I want to do that again. And most adventurers think this is fantastic. I love it. This is something I want to continue doing. So therefore, you have to learn very quickly how to interact with the natural world, with something that is so powerful that it could snuff you out in a second if it really was a competition. And there is nothing you can do to combat or to beat, or so you have to work in a very different way. You have to understand what the little nuanced bits of information mean. You have to develop the skills to actually dance within, with nature, if you like. So you're moving with nature in a way that means you actually have to figure out not so much what do I do to force my way through this, but how do I change the way that I interact with the natural world that allows me to get from A to B in a way that means I come out the other end having, still with all my limbs and all those sort of things, enabling me to do it again. And the only way you can do that is to accept that you're far smaller than the natural world. You're insignificant with regards to the natural world. And actually, it's you that has to adapt. It's you that has to develop the skills. You have to develop the physiology. You have to understand what those bits of nuanced information mean. You have to adapt to that. So it is the individual that has to change. And I've spoken to, as part of my extreme sports research, medical practitioners. One who said, before I went into adventure, I saw people as numbers in a bed. After adventure, I realized that actually the Mr. or Mrs. whatever they may be, and they've got families, they've got other things going on in their life, not just what they happen to be in the hospital for at that time. So that sense of humility, that sense of realizing that actually we're far smaller than we like to think we are, and we're far more insignificant than like we think we are, and actually we have to adapt, and we have to, we have to be much more in relation to the physical environment, feeds into the way we interact in our everyday lives too. So the way we interact in our social environments is very, very different, and we start to realize that actually, these people that are yelling at us right now, they've got lots going on, or it's maybe not that important, the kind of particular issue that I'm having at the moment. So why am I needing to get all uptight and irate and whatever about it? What's going on here? So you learn based on that interaction. People tend to, or seem to learn, and that changes the way that they function more broadly, not just in relation to the natural world, but in relation to all other environments too.
Yeah, yeah. So it's that humility transfers right over. You function with it in those social environments. and in your private environments too. Yeah, that's really really fascinating. Well, Dr. Brymer, we are getting close to having to part ways here, but I did want to ask one more question to you, and it might be a one that you might have to think about for a second. But so, as I mentioned earlier, you've been conducting research for over 2 decades. What has been the most fascinating investigation you have conducted?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one for me because I found them all fascinating. I'll be honest. But the ones that often open my eyes to really interesting ways of thinking about things are the ones that involve students. So, somebody doing a PhD, or even sometimes somebody doing an honors degree for that matter. And you can have a conversation with somebody, and you suddenly sit there and thinking, "Wow, that I never thought about that," but that's really, really fascinating. So, and in many ways, it's the students that have changed my perspective on some of the things the way I look at some of the things now, and the way that I understand, and the way that I've interpreted some of the information that I might have gathered in the early days, and realized that actually I've been looking at that in a relatively, because I've been brought up in the same society, same culture as everybody else has done. So some of the ways that I have been looking at some of the data that I have has been very limited by my own experiences. So when a student comes along and says, "Well, what about this way of looking at it?" You think, "Oh, wow." So that to me, those have been often the most fascinating, the most sort of interesting bits of research that I've been. And there's been a few of those. Most recently, there's a researcher in Finland, a research student in Finland that I work with, who's looking at adventure and taking an ecological psychology perspective on it. Ecological psychology is very different to traditional psychology, and his perspective on some of the things that we're talking about now is sort of fundamentally within the ecological psychology approach, and that in itself has changed some of the interpretations I've made from my own study, my own PhD many years ago. So those are the kind of things that fascinate me now. Often not is often rethinking the way that we traditionally would view things, and trying to explore them in a more sort of a real way. In the early days, introduction to phenomenology was another, because that really allowed me to go beyond traditional psychology and sociology and cultural work to get to the essence of the lived experience, which opened up so many doors to my understanding as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like through your research, you've learned a lot about how you think and just how you
Oh yeah.
function in your brain, and which is really cool. And with introducing, the students' perspectives, it's like, oh gosh, like I had this assumption in my head, or I had this
Mm,
bias in my head, and
mm,
you rewire your thinking too, and that's just cool.
Yeah, it's. I found those the most wonderfully challenging things, because in the end, those kind of relationships start off with me supposed to be the expert and them coming along to learn from me. But very, very quickly, I find that actually it's often the other way around. And then, we're figuring things out together, and I'm learning more from them in many ways than perhaps they are from me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, it's time to wrap it up, and we're going to call an episode here. I'm going to put on that outro music. Dr. Brymer, thank you so much for connecting from Australia, bringing all these, more than 2 decades worth of knowledge to this episode, and delivering quality content. So thank you.
You're very, very welcome, Brian, and thank you very much for inviting me.
You're welcome. Okay.